Welcome back to Velshi and Rule. We are 4 months into 2019. The NBC News desk is deploying camera crews like Election Day was upon us. That's because in this hour alone, not one, not two, but three Democratic presidential candidates, this is live right now, are speaking. It's fast becoming the norm. This hour, Amy Klobuchar and Bernie Sanders talking infrastructure at a Las Vegas conference. Pete Buttigieg right around the corner at a coffee shop in Las Vegas. This is him speaking earlier this weekend. Buttigieg stole the spotlight over the weekend when he opened up about his personal journey while speaking to a crowd at an LGBT fundraiser.
When I was younger, I would have done anything to not be gay. When I began to halfway realize what it meant that I felt the way I did about people I saw in the hallway at school or the dining hall in college, it launched in me something I can only describe as a kind of war. And if that war had been settled on the terms that I would have wished for when I was 15 or 20 or frankly even 25, I would not be standing here. If you had offered me a pill to make me straight, I would have swallowed it before you had time to give me a sip of water. It was a hard thing to think about now. It's hard to face the truth that there were times in my life when if you had shown me exactly what it was inside me that made me gay, I would have cut it out with a knife. And the reason it's so awful to think about isn't just the knowledge that so many young people struggling to come to terms with their sexuality or their gender identity do just that. They harm themselves, figuratively or literally. But the real reason that it's so hard to think about is if I had the chance to do that, I would never have found my way to Chasten. But the best thing in my life, my marriage, might not have happened at all. Thank God there was no pill. Thank God there was no knife. Speaking only for myself, I can tell you that if me being gay was a choice, it was a choice that was made far, far above my pay grade. And that's the thing I wish the Mike Pences of the world would understand. That if you got a problem with who I am, your problem is not with me. Your quarrel, sir, is with my Creator.
I don't want to bring in Washington Post political reporter Eugene Scott, who I sometimes turn to help me, help me parse these things. I've been paying close attention to Pete Buttigieg, as apparently have a lot of voters. His new piece, Eugene's new piece in the Washington Post, highlights Buttigieg's relationship with Christianity and LGBT rights. Eugene, that's pretty powerful stuff. He talked about taking a pill to make him straight if he could have done that, cutting out that which is inside me that made me gay. And it causes a lot of people to ask questions, right? Is that how a lot of people feel as they're coming out? My executive producer said in her case, she did, that what Pete Buttigieg said was something that a lot of people feel when they're coming out. Who's he talking to? Who's Pete Buttigieg talking to? Because the people who are gay know that. Who's he talking to?
Well, there are quite a few different groups that Pete is talking to, and one group that he's talking to is young people who he was once like. These gay youth grappling with their sexuality and trying to reconcile it with their faith, who live in very conservative traditional states and wondering if there is enough room for them within Christianity, despite the fact that they are not straight. And he's communicating that it does get better, that there is hope, that they can find later in life people and communities and even congregations that let them know that there is a place for them in this world. And one thing I think that's really fascinating about Pete's campaign is that while many of the other Democratic candidates are regularly attacking Donald Trump, Pete's pretty targeted on and focused on Mike Pence, the former governor of his state of Indiana, specifically when it comes to LGBT issues, and wants to communicate that despite Pence developing a bit of a reputation as one of the more prominent faces of Christianity in politics, Pete wants to communicate that there actually are far more Christians who are more accepting of people who are different than you would know if you just only listen to the Pences of the world. Is there an appeal there to evangelicals more broadly? Pete Buttigieg does not seem to be in conflict with his faith. He doesn't seem to think it's a problem. Is he trying to send that message to evangelicals to say you shouldn't have a problem with it either? Certainly. There's been some criticism of Pete saying that he's probably not going to win the conservative evangelicals that Trump won. I don't think that's his goal or his focus. I think what he's trying to do is reach voters, including evangelicals, whose faith is central to how they perceive policy and politics, but letting them know that they have to move forward in their faith and in this world and in this political climate with a worldview and values that value people more diverse than themselves and perhaps not like themselves, and that faith can be bigger than what it's been communicated very regularly in these last few years since Pence and Trump have been in the White House.
What's the value of the transparency in the campaign that Pete Buttigieg is showing? He's talking a lot about a topic that some would say downplay. If you're the mayor of a city, you are a Rhodes Scholar, former Rhodes Scholar, a military veteran. This isn't the thing to make central to your campaign. He doesn't seem to be troubled by that.
No, because authenticity is always going to be a high value and priority for voters in these primary elections, especially when you're someone who doesn't have as much name recognition as Pete Buttigieg. And so very much the response to him has been, who is this guy? And he's trying to answer that. He's trying to say, this is who I am. This is the path and the journey that I've been on. And he's actually hitting on some universal themes of human beings being uncomfortable with who they really are in their youth and their developing stages, only to discover that who they are at their core is actually fine, it's actually great, and that they should actually use those experiences to put in place ideas, values, and policies that make this country better for more people.
You sent a tweet today that I thought was interesting, in which you say lots of talk about how President Trump has reshaped the Republican Party, not as much talk about how he's reshaped American Christianity, specifically white evangelicals. What's the change you're talking about?
Well, there were some conservative Christians attacking Pete after his speech, thinking that, or arguing, should I say, that there's no way that conservative Christians who voted for Trump are going to look at Pete's interpretation and understanding of his faith and support him and get behind that and align with him. And it's just fascinating watching conservative Christians look at someone like Pete, who is married, who in very ways espouses traditional family male Western values, and say that he is far less attractive to conservative voters than someone who allegedly cheated on his third wife with multiple women in the adult entertainment industry and can't even quote a Bible verse. The fact that he continues to get high approval ratings from conservative Christians is telling in terms of where conservative Christians have focused and put their energy when it comes to politics moving forward.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.